family. Thanks for joining us for this online teaching for the week. Even though we're not able to be together in person, we are so grateful that we're able to be together in this way. Encourage you to grab your Bibles. We're going to be reading from Genesis 1, and I'm going to read the full text for us this week that we're looking at through this series. Genesis 1, starting in verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the day light, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning one day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters, separating water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse sky. Evening came and then morning, the second day. Then God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear," and it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds." And it was so. The earth produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. Evening came, and then morning, the third day. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for seasons and for days and years. They will be lights in the expanse of the sky to provide a light on the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule over the day and the lesser light to rule over the night, as well as the stars. God placed them in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth, to rule the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. Evening came and then morning, the fourth day. Then God said, "Let the water swarm with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the large sea creatures and every living creature that moves and swarms in the water according to their kinds. He also created every winged creature according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them. "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." Evening came and then morning, the fifth day. Then God said, "Let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that crawl, and the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. So God made the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth." So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the land." God also said, "Look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seed. This will be food for you. For all the wildlife of the earth, for every bird of the sky, and for every creature that crawls on the earth, everything having the breath of life in it, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good indeed. Evening came and then morning, the sixth day. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the seventh day God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation. This is God's word. Well, before we get into what we're going to be talking about today, I want to remind and give us a quick update on where we've been. We've been looking at two texts, the text that I just read from Genesis 1, and we've also been looking at this very ancient, wonderful text, Goldilocks and the Three Dinosaurs, as retold by Mo Willems. And again, I just give a plug. Mo Willems is such a fantastic author. Whether you have kids or not, it's a kid's book, but everybody will get something out of it. But in the past couple weeks, we've been looking at something from that book and something from Genesis 1 because they go together. At the end of Goldilocks and the Three Dinosaurs, Mo Willems gives two morals of the story. And the first one is, if you're in the wrong story, leave. If you find yourself in the wrong story, leave. And I'm convinced that many of us come to Genesis 1, the text that we just read, with the wrong story. We're looking at it in the wrong ways. We're asking the wrong types of questions. And so this whole series is an invitation for us to leave. that old story, to walk out the unlocked back door and re-walk into a new story and look at Genesis 1 in a different way. The second week, we started 3 weeks of ground clearing, where we're just going to be clearing the ground so that we can hopefully look at Genesis 1 correctly. And so we looked at in Genesis 1, in Goldilocks and the Three Dinosaurs, it says that this is a story that's retold by Mo Willems. And many of us will know that there's a very similar story that we have from our childhood or from reading to our kids or grandkids, which is Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And many of us could probably tell that story without a book in front of us. It's so familiar to us. And in a similar way, Genesis 1 is doing the same thing. The ancient Near East had many other creation narratives around them. And so Genesis 1 is a retelling of those creation stories in a way that highlights the God of the Bible and demotes the other gods of the ancient Near East. So it's doing something very similar to what Mo Willems is doing in his story. And the second thing that we learned, last week we talked about this in our ground clearing, is that Genesis 1 is not speaking into modern science. It's an ancient act of communication into the other creation narratives of the ancient Near East, and it's not in conversation with modern science. If we come to Genesis 1 with our modern scientific questions, which are really great questions, how old is the earth? What was the order of things that were created? Those are wonderful questions, but they can't be answered by Genesis 1. It's just not that kind of literature. Just like if we came to Mo Willems' book and we asked, what kind of beds did dinosaurs really sleep in? Or were there dinosaurs who spoke Norwegian? This is a very important question. But they can't really be answered by this kind of book. And it's the same thing that happens when we come to Genesis 1. A very important text, not in conversation with modern science. And so today we are going to finish our ground clearing by looking at Genesis 1 again. And here's our big statement, that Genesis 1 is written for ancient people, the ancient people of Israel, for the people, the main people that are in the story of the Bible. And it's written as an introduction to two things specifically. The first is the nature and the character of their God. And it's talking about and trying to introduce them to their God in a way that they will learn to be in relationship with him, but also to worship him. So to know him and to worship him alone. And the second introduction that it is an introduction to the story of the Bible that will unfold in the pages that we see ahead of us and unfold in history. Because in the rest of the story of the Bible, God will continually choose people to participate with him in his story and carry his name past Genesis 1. So the God that we see in Genesis 1 in the story that's starting, God will choose people to carry this story on and carry his name into the rest of the story. But they will continually be tempted to let go of God and change the narrative from Genesis 1. And they do this in specifically 3 ways. They choose, instead of worshiping the God that we see in Genesis 1, to worship other gods. Secondly, they try to control God, that this God who has created all things, they'll try to control him. And then thirdly, they will try to become like gods themselves rather than God to be gods. And so this is our outline for today. We're going to look at all 3 of these things because I think even though this is an ancient story and it's written as an introduction to ancient people, to their God and to their story, it's not unlike us. When we read Genesis 1 and you hear a great sermon like you're going to hear today, and you hear about how great God is, you might think, yeah, I want to go, I want to live for him. I want this to be the start of my story and the name that I carry into my world. But maybe you're sitting on the couch right now and you're flipping through Instagram, or you're going and shopping on Amazon, and your heart will be pulled in different directions to go and worship other things, to find your meaning and your hope and your satisfaction there. Or maybe this afternoon you'll go and you'll chat with your neighbors, and you'll think like, they're not actually doing so bad in life. They may be totally disconnected from the story of Genesis 1, but it seems like their lives are fine. And thirdly, we might find our lives out of control. We might think that if I just pray to God more, if I kind of level up in my Christianity, then my life will become more under control. And so we struggle with these same things, I think, that the people of Genesis, or the people originally reading Genesis 1 did as well. And so we need to go back and look at this story well in order that we might be able to have it be the introduction to our story and for us to carry the name of God correctly into the world. So let's look at the first temptation, the first way that the Israelite people got it wrong and the way that Genesis 1 tries to correct them and us. The first way is that they would continually go and worship other gods. Now, in the ancient Near East, one of the most common practices was called polytheism. This is a monotheism, is that there is only one God. This is the view that's represented in Genesis 1. Polytheism is that there's many gods, and we can pick and choose or worship all of them. And in the world of the ancient Near East, the gods were very unpredictable. And so if you hear about another god, you should probably just add him into the mix. And the ancient Israelites were constantly guilty of this. They'd say, I know Yahweh is our God. He's the God of Israel. He says he's the only God, but Baal, he is the God of fertility. And my wife and I have been really having a hard time, having a baby. So I'm going to hedge my bets, and I'm not going to stop worshiping Yahweh, but I'm just going to add in a little bit of worship of Baal too. Now, of course, today we don't struggle with the same thing. There's maybe some of us who hear about, in a multicultural society that there's people worshiping other gods, and we might think, yeah, I want to add a bit of that into my worship of God as well. But many of us hedge our bets by not worshiping other gods, but just worshiping other things. Few of us we're going to go make a sacrifice to Kutharot, but many of us worship marriage and kids, which is what that group of gods stood for. I don't think anyone this afternoon is going to go and build a shrine to Dagon in their backyard, if you have a backyard. But many of us measure our lives by success. Whether it's in our careers or in our bank accounts or in our relationship, whatever that is, we worship success, which is what Dagon stood for in Canaanite culture. I don't know if anyone has a Shadrapha idol in their house, but as a culture, we're obsessed with our health and our wellness, which is what she was the goddess of. So in our world, we've just cut out the middleman. We're not going to go and bring a Shadrapha idol into our house, most likely, but we still worship those things. We choose other things outside of God to worship. And behind this is the same sneaking suspicion that the Israelite people had, that one God is probably not really enough. He's just one, and he can't provide for all of the things that I need in the world. So I need to take care of myself. I'll just add a couple more in, kind of hedge my bets that way. And I'll give myself over to God. If I give myself over to him fully and I just choose to worship him, there's a chance that I'm going to miss out on something else good. So I need a few other gods to round out all the gods that I have in my life. So how does Genesis 1 answer this? Why is the God of Genesis 1 put forward as worthy of all of our worship? So this is going to be, I'll say this one will be a little bit longer and maybe a bit nerdy, but it will land, I think, hopefully in a good place. Because we're going to look at the structure of Genesis 1. Because every good story actually has a structure. Goldilocks and the Three Bears, for example, has a structure that Mo Willems uses in Goldilocks and the Three Dinosaurs. Now, you've probably never thought of it like this because you don't generally think of children's stories as nerdy. But Goldilocks has a structure, and it's kind of based around threes. There are three bears. Then when Goldilocks enters the house, there are three stations, oatmeal or porridge, I don't know which is the correct one, chairs, and then beds. At each station, there are three options. The porridge is too hot, and then one of the porridge is too cold, and then the other porridge is just right. That's how we read it in my house. And this structure creates the story and helps us to understand the big points as it does in Goldilocks and the Three Bears and the Three Dinosaurs. And the same thing is happening in Genesis 1. It's just going to take a few minutes and it's going to be kind of nerdy to get there. So stick with me for a couple minutes here. So in Genesis 1, here's the structure. Day 2, we have a problem. Tohu wabohu. That the world is unformed and it's also uninhabited. And so the creation narrative of God is going to go about solving those things. So in day 1, verse 3, we see that God creates light and dark. That's day and night. In day 2, he creates the rakia. We talked about this last week. It's like a dome that separates the waters above and the waters below. And then day 3, he creates dry land. And then there's a bonus act of creation on day 3 that God creates vegetation. So here in these first 3 days, God has solved the first problem, tohu, but the world was unformed. There was no space for shalom to happen. And functionally, we have now the heavens and the earth, day 1, 2, and 3. It's a formed world. Day 4, we get the sun and the moon. Now, these are the functionaries of day 1, the match of day 1. They fill the space of light and dark. And it helps to answer our question from last week. Why is there light on day 1 and without the sun and the moon until day 4? Again, it's not a science story. It's not a chronological story. It's a structured story. And what God is doing is creating the space, and then he's filling the space. He creates the space of light and dark, and he's filling that space with the sun and the moon. Day 5, he creates creatures of the expanse above. These are birds that fly up near the top of the rakia, which is where in the ancient mind water was. And then there are creatures of the sea that go in the water below. They fill those spaces. And then day 6, we fill the last space, the space created in day 3, the dry land and the use of vegetation. So these are creatures of the earth. And then also humans, so animals and humans. And then we have a bonus act where the vegetation is given over them to eat them, or to feed them, for them to eat. So this is the structure of Genesis 1. It's taking a world that's tohu wavohu, that is unformed and unfilled, and it is forming it and then filling it. That's what God is doing. And here's the really important thing for us. All 6 of these days in the ancient Near East, all of the objects that are created on these days were viewed as gods in the ancient Near East. The light, rakia, the land, the sun and the moon, the Leviathan, which is this big sea monster that lives in the ocean. Big land animals like bulls especially were thought of as gods. And then people, specifically kings, were thought of as gods. And so each of these days of creation were worshipped as gods in other creation stories in the ancient Near East. Now, what about each of these things in the story of creation we just read? Well, they're not gods. They're just created as elements of our world. God is putting them in their place. And here's one really fun example. Well, I think it's fun. Anyways, the sun and the moon don't even get names on their day. If you noticed on day 4, let me read in verse 16. God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule over the day and the lesser light to rule over the night, as well as the stars. So it's interesting. Why didn't he just call them sun and moon? Instead, the greater light and the lesser light. Dr. Ian Provane from Regent College says there were perfectly good words for the sun and the moon, the Hebrew words shemek and uriah. So why not use them? Well, these Hebrew words would remind the early reader of the gods associated with those names, which were very important to the neighbors. And the authors of Genesis 1 are trying to be as clear as possible. The sun and the moon are important. They serve a very important function in our cosmos, but they are not divine. So they're not even going to use the names. They're just created things. And so Genesis 1 is trying to say as clearly as it can that God is not a creation or a part of the creation. He stands apart from it. Instead, he is the creator of all. He is God of absolutely everything. And so when we experience the tohu wabohu and the chaos waters threatening to take over our lives, which we all do, we shouldn't go and worship something else, hoping that it will save us, something that's created. Instead, we should come to the God of the Bible who's pushed back the waters and created a space of flourishing for us. When we're tempted to add other gods to the mix, saying, I'm not sure that I'm fully satisfied or that God will be able to fully satisfy me, and to put our hopes in more and more things, our portfolio or our family or our job, Genesis 1 says the invitation is instead to come to this God that we see in Genesis 1. Everything else is just created. He is the true creator. He is the one that stands eternal beyond all things. The God of the Bible is the God over all, the cosmic king. And so in the moments that we feel unsatisfied, we're instead of going and finding other gods actually to double down on coming to him. He is great, and so we don't have to look elsewhere for our satisfaction. So that's the first, the way that Genesis 1 answers this first temptation that the ancient Near East people had, and we have as well, to go find our hope in other gods, adding them to the mix. The second temptation for the Israelite people that pulled them away from the God that we see in Genesis 1 is that they tried to control God. Rather than letting him be this creator God that we see in Genesis 1, they tried to control him. Now, in order to understand this, we need to really allow our minds to go back, to hop in a flight in a time machine, as I said. Because in the ancient Near East, the gods were dangerous and unpredictable. They exerted a lot of power over the world and culture. And in the God that we see in Genesis 1 has power over everything. He is the ultimate God. And so he doesn't just oversee fertility or fire or water. He oversees everything, and therefore he's more dangerous than any of the other gods in the pantheon. And in ancient Near Eastern time, words were like a kind of power. So if you have a powerful person, their word means more. And of course, if you have a god, their word has even more power. And their words were looked at like kind of like magic. So if we can know the words of the god, then we can have some kind of the power of the god as well. If you've ever watched or read Harry Potter, there's one scene where Hermione, who is kind of always coming and correcting people, Harry is trying to do a magic trick, and she comes to him and she says, "You're saying the wrong words. It's not illigentium, it's illigentia," or something to that effect. And this is the same kind of idea as those in the ancient Near East. If we could just figure out the right word, the right incantation, the words of the god, then we would have the power of the god. We have the power to control. And in the creation narratives, maybe even the power to create the world. We could become like God. And so imagine if the God of the Bible is the most powerful God, he's the only God in the world, really, according to Genesis 1, and he tells us right here in these pages his words that he used to create the world. Imagine how much power we could have if we mimic them or learn them. Imagine how we could control the world. We would become like gods. Now, I know none of us think like that today. We're not trying to memorize Genesis 1 in the Hebrew so that we can gain some sort of control over the world. But I don't think it's actually a different perspective to the way that we look at our world. Because many of us use God or Christianity like a magic stick. That God becomes a means for us to get what it is that we ultimately want, what we actually want. Now, this might sound kind of crazy because none of us would ever say this out loud, but here's an example of how it works. Many Christians, I think, are Christians because they share the values of majority Christian culture. It's basically having a good middle-class life. So having security and a family and happiness. And God and Christianity, therefore, becomes a means to get those things. We think, if I read the Bible or I go to church, if I give, if I serve, then I'll get those things that I ultimately want. And so it looks like we're following God, but what we're actually doing is using him to get what we want. And we haven't let go of control of our lives at all. In fact, we're trying to control everything. And here's how you know if you're trying to play God, if you are using God as a magic stick to try to get what you ultimately want. Every once in a while, the Holy Spirit will come into our lives in his grace, and he'll just give us a little nudge. And he'll say, this thing that you value, that you hold so tightly, it's good, but it's not ultimate. I want you to let go. I want you to give it up. Or maybe he'll come and he'll ask us to give control over an area that we have in our lives that we really value. Maybe we really value our money, and God will come to say, hey, I want you to give this much away. He'll push us out of our comfort zone. Or maybe he'll bring a person into your life, a person who's also a Christian, who's passionate about Jesus, but who doesn't share those values, who thinks something very different than you. And he'll ask you to change the way that you look at life and open yourself up to this person. And it's a very uncomfortable thing. And if you say no, every one of us as Christians has those experiences. And if we say no to those experiences, we close that door. It's because for us, Christianity has not been about giving God control of our lives, but it's about controlling God to get what we ultimately want, those things, those values that we hold. This is one of the ways that we share the same temptation of those in the ancient Near East. We're actually not that different. We're looking to control our life and our world, to create some sort of magic that the things that we absolutely value can happen, and we use God to that means. So how does Genesis 1 respond to this? Well, it doesn't give us a manageable God at all, but an ultimate and glorious one. Listen to commentator Nahum Sarna. He says this: God's speech acts in Genesis 1 are not the utterances of a magic word, but the expression of the omnipotent, sovereign, unchallengeable will of the absolute transcendent God to whom all nature is completely subservient. So for the authors of Genesis 1, the power is not in the words themselves, but it's in the person. It's in God himself. See, the God of Genesis 1 is not a God we can manage or control, but the all-transcendent sovereign God of the universe, the creator of all. Sarna continues, such an idea of God, that the power is not in the words, but in God himself, and the process of creation added a new dimension to human thought and marked a new stage in the history of religion. It emancipated the mind from the limitations of mythopoetic thinking, and it liberated religion from the baneful influence of magic. What he's saying here is that Genesis 1 was actually an evolution in religion. That their invitation away from this magic way of thinking about God and towards a relationship with this powerful God, one who can't be manipulated by his words or used to create your ultimate life, but someone who wants to be in relationship with you, who wants you to bear his name and carry his story throughout history. And the God of Genesis 1 is never a means to an end. He's the Alpha and the Omega, the one who existed before all time. And his words are given to us not so we can use them as magic, so we can control our lives, but so that we can actually know him and learn to hear his voice. And he offers us his name, not so that we can manipulate our world with it or gain power over it, but that we might carry it into the world and reflect and shine his name into our world. And he exposes himself to us, not so we can control him, but that we might worship him and reflect him. The omnipotent, sovereign, unchallengeable will of the absolute transcendent God to whom all nature is completely subservient. So that's the second way that the ancient Near East people and us can get God wrong and get off the tracks of the story. And Genesis 1 offers a corrective to us, that God is not a God that is manageable or a God that we can use to control our world, but rather he is the sovereign God of the universe. The third temptation for the Israelite people, and the final one, was to act as if they were gods themselves. And in the story of the Bible, one of the biggest ways that humans do this is by defining for themselves what is good. And we only need to go ahead a few more chapters in Genesis to see that happening. In Genesis 3, the first people in the story, Adam and Eve, define what's good for themselves with disastrous consequences for the couple, but also for the entire human race. And this is them choosing to be gods themselves by defining what is good for themselves. And I can't think of any better parallel to our modern story, because most of us, whether we're Christians or we're not, we see this God of Genesis 1 as something completely outside of our world. We've locked him out of our world. And we tend to function as if we're gods. And we have the power to decide what human flourishing should look like, what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wrong. And in many ways, it's worked out okay. We need to be honest about that. You know, whether we wake up this morning, turn on this video to learn more about God's word, or you just woke up, your neighbor woke up and went to brunch, life is pretty good. You know, we just used our powers of technology to cure this deadly disease that's been going on, COVID, and we're on our way out of that, and everyone's excited. You know, life is pretty good for all of us. But there are upsides to being able to play God, there are downsides. And I want to just name two this morning. That the first one is this: when we get the freedom to decide what the good life is, then we also have the pressure to decide what the good life is. Listen to sociologist Harmit Rosa. He said, if a kid asks what to do with his or her life, questions such as, should I play soccer or the flute? Should I be interested in politics? Should I believe in God? Whom should I marry? Where should I live? Teachers, friends, and family will be sure to offer their advice, but they will almost inevitably rush to add, just find out for yourself. Listen to your heart. Come to know your talents and your yearnings. The good life has become even more delicate by the fact that the background conditions of the life to be led are changing quickly. You can never know what you will want or what you will need in the future. The world will change, and your own outlook on life will change too. Hence, the answer to what kind of life should I strive for has become very elusive, shrouded in uncertainty. He's putting his finger on our modern world. That we feel we have the power to define what is right for ourselves, to chart our own path, but then we also bear the weight of that. There's the existential weight of like this ultimate question looming in our lives. And that puts amazing amounts of anxiety on us. Am I going to choose the right path or the wrong path? And many of us find ourselves paralyzed in those decisions. If you remember back to a couple weeks ago, I talked about this with the song Helplessness Blues. Just someone just tell me what to do. I don't know what it is that I should do. And if you just told me, I'd work at it until I was sore. It's because they're dealing with that helplessness that's created when we play God. But there's a second problem to this when we choose to define what's the good life looks like for ourselves. It's that we'll always be performing. Now I know Harmit Rosa, many of you guys have his books on your shelves, you're very familiar. But for those who don't, I'm going to go to someone a little bit more close to home, Rocky, to define this for us, that we'll always be performing if we choose to be gods. And this is from one of the Rocky movies. He's speaking to his girlfriend Adrian about fighting Apollo Creed. And he says, I just want to prove something. I ain't no bum. It don't matter if I lose. It don't matter if he opens my head. The only thing I want to do is go the distance. That's all. Nobody's ever gone 15 rounds with Creed. If I go them 15 rounds and that bell rings and I'm still standing, I'm going to know that I weren't just another bum from the neighborhood. What he's saying here is that this is the way that he knows his life will count, that he goes 15 rounds. I'll do something that no one's ever done. In this way, I'll stand out. And it turns life by charting your own, defining the good life yourself, it puts it into the place of competition. I'll do something that no one has ever done before. And then he says, if I do that, everybody will cheer my name and I'll know that I'm not a bum. I'll stand in that ring with my head held high and I'll know that my life means something. And he's saying this, life is a performance. If I define good for myself, I can define good for myself, but for it all to really matter, for me to really feel it, I need someone else to validate me. And for Rocky, one of the interesting things that happens in these movies is that his girlfriend loves him, and she's like, "You don't have to go into the ring for me to love you." But he's always going in there because he has this, undeniable urge that he has to keep proving himself. And he does it over and over, if you've seen the series, and over, even way past his prime, he continues to do this. Because it's this urge that life is a performance. If I've charted out what the good life is, I need actually someone to come and validate that I've made the right choice. So what does Genesis 1 say about this? Well, at the end of every day of creation, it says that God sees the same thing. It says that he saw that it was good. Now, in the language of the Bible, good speaks to the quality of something. Like this is, we might say in English, this is a good shirt. It's got good quality. It also speaks to the fitness of something for its purpose. This is a good screw because it works in this specific hole or with this bolt. And remember back to the structure of Genesis 1. Things are good because they fit within the creation the way that God has made them. It's also linked to the character of God. In the Bible, God is a God who is good. So when he pronounces that over everything, he's saying this is a reflection of me. It is linked to my character, the God who is good. And it's also a word of blessing. Blessing is something that's said over something or someone. It's pronounced on them. And God often gives words of blessing in Genesis 1 to say that this is good, that you are good, that he is coming and validating his creation. And the word good is God's pronouncement over each and every person and everything in the created world. And it's what we were created to hear. It's the way that we were created to be validated. And if we walk away from this story from Genesis 1, saying that we'll be our own gods, that we're going to define right and wrong for ourselves, define the good life, then we'll be forever in search of that word of blessing. In every relationship we start, we'll be looking to be validated, for our choices to be validated. In every ring that we get into, like Rocky, we'll be looking for that way to know that we're not a bum. In every job that we go into, we'll be searching for validation. And everything we put our hands to, we'll be looking for those elusive words, that you are good. I worked as a campus pastor for many years here in the Lower Mainland. And one of the awkward but awesome things that I did early on was we, at the end, when someone was graduating, we would hold a funeral for them in their last year. And at the beginning, we would make them lie in the middle, and then we would all kind of gather around them. But that got a little too awkward. So they just sat in a seat towards the end. And all of us would prepare words of blessing for the person sitting in the seat at the middle. And it's like a bunch of 20-some-year-old guys. It was super awkward usually, and there's lots of like weird jokes. But then inevitably someone would start the honest conversation, and they would start reading. And they would say things about this person that were blessings. They would say, I remember one time I had this really hard chem exam and I didn't know what to do. And you came, you just took your time and you helped me figure these things out. And I did really well in an exam, and I'll never forget the way that you blessed me. Or they'll speak words about that person's character. They'll just say, you're one of the most gentle people that I've ever met. And I hope that I can become more like you, and that reflects God into the world. Or they'll say words of blessings about that person's future. They'll say, you're such a hardworking person. And I know that whatever you go and do in the rest of your life, you'll be successful because you're such a hardworking guy. And the meeting that starts off awkwardly becomes super emotional. And there's rarely been a guy that sat in the middle of that circle who hasn't cried. And I'll say for some of the guys, especially the ones I found who they either didn't have dads or they had absentee dads in their lives, that was became one of the most important moments of their life. And I'll never forget, that one time a guy came and chatted with me years after he graduated. And he said, that was one of the most important things I've ever had happen to me. He said, there are days in my life when I just want to give up, when I want to stop. But I remember the words that you said about me, that you believe in me, and I keep going another day. This is what Genesis 1 wants to offer to us. Imagine if you could hear those words of blessing, not uttered from 8 other guys in a sweaty room in the back of SFU, but from the God of the universe himself. And Genesis 1 is that invitation to hear those words for us, not to go and define right and wrong for ourselves, to go and create our own world of good, but to actually hear the word of God pronounced over us, the blessing of him, that you are good. To hear the words of Jesus from the cross, that it is finished. That although we've all tried to go and play God ourselves, that Jesus has come to reconnect us to God and to our world. There's no more need for us to go out and try to validate ourselves, because he has pronounced over us that we are valuable and brought us back into the story of Genesis 1, into the story of God, that we may carry his name out into the world appropriately. And it's the invitation to hear the voice of the Holy Spirit who comes over us and speaks to us, that he wants to recreate us, to change us from the inside out and make us back into the image of God. So this is Genesis 1. It's an ancient text, but it's a very current invitation, I think, for each one of us. To stop worshiping other gods, to say that they're just part of the creation, and instead to come to the one God who has created all things. To stop trying to control God and instead to enter into a relationship with him where he is the God of the universe. He is the one above all things, and we are the ones who come to worship and to be recreated by him. And to stop playing God, and instead to hear his voice of goodness spoken over us. Let's close in prayer. God, thank you for your word. I pray for each one of us, wherever this hits us, whether we've got other gods. There's just a pantheon of gods that we're worshiping, and you're just one of the many. I pray that you would take your rightful place as the one and only God. Help us to release our hands from the other ones and come to worship you. For those of us who are trying to control you, I pray that you would instead show yourself to be magnificent and glorious in our lives, to take your place there, that we may bow our hearts and our knees and come submissively unto you, the good God who created the whole world. And finally, for those of us, and I think this is all of us in the 21st century, who are so busy trying to play God in our lives, to define what is good and the good life for ourselves, and feeling that pressure and that need for validation,
I ask instead that you would help us to come to you, to hear your words spoken over us, and to take them on for ourselves, that we may take your story and reflect you into the world. We pray these things together in the name of Christ. Amen.